Welcome back to part 2 of our Earth Month conversation with CoreNet Sustainability Committee. In real estate development, we've been discussing how green concepts are often looked as add-ons or additions rather than being integral to fostering a circular economy. We're exploring today a little bit about how that circular economy can increase value, and we're speaking with Eric Brill and Thomas Baade-Mathisesen. So now that we have a way to identify embodied carbon in our society, and we know a little bit about how we want to capitalize on reuse, I want to bring in Thomas and Eric, and really leading into your work, Thomas. This discussion raises an important question on how we evaluate and enhance the visibility of sustainability, both for our partners in the real estate business, but also for those who are practicing day to day. So despite considerable economic and architectural value that's provided by being economically or environmentally conscious, there are certain misconceptions within the industry, and I would love if you'd be able to speak to how we're able to not just overcome them, but how we're able to address that with some of the partners that you work with at Switch & Co.
Yeah, sure. It's a very interesting question because it applies at so many levels, right? It's really about what are the drivers and how can we connect to them. And, you know, at the Switch, as I mentioned in the start, we help investors and business leaders green both real estate and companies for a high return. So that's very high level. How do you do that? But the reason why I'm zooming back out to that level is because if you're working with an investor, they... You know, for example, I work quite a lot with private equity investors. They're looking to raise capital that they then invest in real estate or companies to transform those. And then when those companies or real estate has a higher value, they sell it for a higher return. In that process, if they embed sustainability in the right way, there's a chance that they can add more value to that asset. And at the same time, a lot of people putting money into their funds now are interested in that, and so they are looking for people who align with those values, and for that reason some private equity investors that are using this as a differentiator, if you will, are now able to attract capital more quickly from that angle. So that's like people that invest in companies overall. Then you can go into the company itself and you can ask, well, what drives the company to do sustainability? And, you know, there's often quite a bit of a mix. There may be the differentiation level that we talked about. So it could be differentiating yourself versus key stakeholders. Who are your key stakeholders? Very often it's your talent, right? We've all heard the war for talent. But it's also the market. How can you attract clients, whether you're in B2B or customers, if you're in B2C? Not all of them are making their decisions solely on sustainability, if really at all. But when they're faced with two similar alternatives, an offer or a product that is also sustainable, it's going to be hard to argue against why you wouldn't go for that then, for example. And, you know, there are also a lot of regulations. We mentioned them earlier, so I'm not going to go into that again, but a lot of regulations are also pushing for this. And then, you know, I think there's also just something about challenge and creativity in humans that, you know, why not? This is a fascinating challenge.
We rise to the occasion, right?
Yeah, we rise to the occasion. So there's something about purpose and meaning. And, you know, these are some. But now we're still at company level. Now, I've also worked with this at real estate organization level. And so at that point, you may ask, how can we reflect those interests of investors or of the company leadership in the way that we, you know, whether it's develop or lease real estate? And
yeah,
so
let's talk about that for a second, because you mentioned market differentiation, and a lot of this also has to do with brand or real estate differentiation.
Yes.
So within the real estate market, if you're looking at leasing, let's dive into your work with respect to green leasing and increasing basically market demand for real estate that is green.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so there are two concepts there. Let me quickly go into market demand around assets that are green, and then we'll go into green leasing. Because some ways they are separate, but they also largely go together. I think it's very important for people to note that now real estate that is, for example, that has green building certification is generally valued higher. There was a global meta study of 42 other studies, so an aggregation of lots of studies that found that when it comes to buildings that have a green building certifications, they sell for a 6% premium across the board. And in the case of leasing, 10%. Yesterday I was with a studio leader of a big architect firm here in town who was just sharing some insights from some of his projects in London, where they were now seeing figures that 30% higher premiums on office leases in London that have green building certifications.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
So
It's impactful.
I'm going to use that one.
yeah,
That's
so
good
you
metric to know.
that is fascinating, and
Yeah.
I also know landlords that have told me here in town that one of the first 3 questions usually that they get asked by the big techs and finance firms of the world is about sustainability. How is this asset positioned when it comes to sustainability? But if we dive into the other part of your question, which is around green leasing, okay, so what is green leasing? A green lease is really just any real estate lease where we have also embedded the interests and responsibilities around sustainability. So depending on the situation, there may be different interests. But if you want, I can actually share a little story about
I
how
think
one
that'd
of
be
these
great
played out.
because we'd be able to consider what the tenants' interests are. It could be economic drivers, they could be ESG goals, they could be just values within the company itself. So please take it away.
And this example is one of my favorite examples because I think it shows how this doesn't have to be a heavy lift. So a couple of summers ago, let's go back, it's basically June 2022, and I'm sitting over a plate of pasta over lunch with the head of real estate of a big international investment bank. And we had just spoken about some sustainability stuff at an event a few weeks before. But today he wants to talk about something very specific. And so he says, Thomas, we are looking at moving our headquarters in Manhattan. And in that decision, we can either stay or we can go. And in the stay option, we're faced with some challenges because the building that we have been in so far isn't that modern compared to some of the fancy new properties that are being built. And if we stay, we need to figure out how we can make that as sustainable as possible for many of the reasons that we mentioned just in the previous answer. And so he said, this green leasing thing, how does that play out? How can we do that? And so we pulled together a project around that. And how did we go about that project? Well, first we started asking ourselves, well, let's have a closer look at this building that you're in right now. And let's also have a closer look at your company. So we analyzed the bank first, and we asked, well, what are the sustainability priorities of the bank? Climate change was a big one, for example. But employees also care a lot about more specific stuff like waste, because it's just more tangible than CO2 in the air. And the list goes on. Obviously, air quality in the wake of COVID was important, human health, attracting people back. All of these became part of the mix. So we came with that bag of interests over to the building side to analyze the building. And we did a quick review of the building, and then we compiled a set of questions that we threw over the hedge to the landlord and the representatives. This is where it gets a little interesting because it became very quiet. And they basically come back and say, so are you interested in this? And we're like, well, we're kind of looking at each other because that's obviously why we sent the questionnaire over. So they say, so we're like, yes, very much so. And they say, okay, hold on. And another few weeks go by, and we're really thinking, gosh, this is going to be a tough one. You hear a lot about lawyers getting all nervous when you throw extra clauses into the lease, and this is going to be really antagonistic. So we're bracing ourselves here. But as they come back, they had been really busy in the weeks in between. And they had spoken with their investors, because there was a mixed ownership group of quite sophisticated investors and some smaller ones. And they had found out that they were going to turn this into it was actually going to become a priority project for the portfolio that they were managing and owning together for the Northeast. And so what happened here was that we were doing a green leasing process, but before we had even entered details of the lease or negotiation, we had just started, the green lease had started a conversation which had initiated interests, initiatives from both sides. And so now suddenly they were actually looking to upgrade features of the building
that otherwise they might not have been looking to change. You were able to drive that conversation forward.
To keep them? Is that what you mean?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And so they realized that it was partly to keep them, but the interesting thing was this tenant, there were other tenants as well, and they realized that if they're going to stay competitive post-pandemic, then, in the face of these other modern buildings coming up, they needed to do something. So it was largely to keep them. And then at this point, you might also ask, okay, also, all of this sounds very nice, but just even more specifically, what is this? Like, what is a green lease? So some questions that what we would be asking about would be regarding data. So it's actually a mutual interest. Tenants would like information about the building, and they use it for their disclosures. Now, at one site, that might not be too complicated, but when you have 20, multiple 30, sites, 50 sites, it's like pulling teeth, and it gets awful. So if you can already have an agreement up front that feeds the tenants with the information they need, they're going to be very happy. But the same goes the other way around. Landlords also want information about the buildings, and especially maybe more in like a triple net lease situation where they don't necessarily have the rights to information, but they still need to disclose on what's going on with their portfolios. If you can bake information sharing into the lease, both sides are happy. And
I think that competitive advantage, and then also that transparency, which we're going to come back to, is a great jumping off point to bring you in, Eric, because design, coming from an architect's point of view, helps drive this bus. And really, when the client went away and met with their team, I'm sure they were looking at the market as a whole and trying to see how they could meet and exceed expectations for the future of a green New York. So how are we as architects, yourself and Johns, and able to really drive that forward, and then not just instill it within our own firms, but instill it within the marketplace?
Yeah, great question. I think to add on to Thomas, I mean, our clients and all these stakeholders, they want healthy, sustainable buildings, right? And that's forefront and center when they're looking at buildings that will retain and attract value, right? So it's really important that we design for those in our clients. One thing is like going back is like really education is really important at Gensler, and I imagine NHLW in our firm. So we need to make sure that our designers and architects and technicians in our climate action group is really kind of training our designers across the firm. And we've done that pretty well over the last couple of years, where we make personal commitments to sustainability. We follow our own GC3 goals and climate action and what the AIA 2030 is doing, so I can adapt to that as well. And I think having those personal commitments, and even we have everyone do a carbon analysis of like their own life. And so you really start to find out like where you live makes a difference, and how you travel to home and commute.
And I'm sure that really changes depending on different locations.
Exactly.
Your architects.
So now everyone knows like what their carbon footprint is in a given year, even looking at their electrical and gas bills too. So once you start to open up your eyes to that, everyone's like, wow, we really can do a better job. And so that's where we start with education, I think. going back to part of the question is, our clients, over the last, maybe 5-10 years, there's roles that have been developed in our clients, with our global sustainability directors or, resilience directors and all these other types of people that are really engaged, from a fundamental level of kind of moving their, for company and firms, ESG goals or sustainability goals. So that helps us drive the bus.
What's fascinating about that though, is I've found, I don't know if you guys find this too, sometimes those people with those titles are not talking to the facilities team or the leasing team.
Bring them together.
Yeah, because I'll show up to meetings with clients and I'll be like, hey, we understand you have these amazing ESG targets, and they're like, oh, we do. Like sometimes they don't know.
Exactly.
And it's just the nature of massive organizations, and sometimes those things don't get communicated down. So let's chat about, because I want to know if you guys have cracked the code on that. That'd be amazing.
Well, no, I mean, you have, whether you're working with a developer and they have a leasing group versus their operations group versus working with a corporation that also has aspirational goals, and then they have people on the ground who are putting this into place. So what I wanted to ask you about was the responsibility for embedding that within our systems. We can either look at it as a top-down, where we're designing something so innovative or cutting edge that people have to take care of it or learn to adapt to these new systems. But there's a flip side to that as well, and that I think we might want to consider as part of this is, how much of our education within our firms and even our architectural education should be about understanding operation and coming to those who are implementing it, so there's less of that disconnect. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's important once a project is, even like we were used to doing projects and then they're finished and we walk away, right? And they're on to the next one. I think analyzing and evaluating the operation team and how they're using their spaces, residential, commercial, whatever the project is, I think is so important. So how we've kind of measured success, right? So you started early on in a project and you program the project with your clients and the sustainability director, bringing them together. What are their goals? What are measures of success? Is this going to be a 50, 70 year life cycle, hopefully, of this building or system? And the product's going to be designed to withstand, to be relocated again, right? That's really important. So I think getting on board, we call it programming, and we also use the word visioning with our clients to really identify these aspirational goals and how we were going to get there. Obviously looking at cost and budget and all the implications, but it really, depending on how large the client stakeholder group is and decision makers are, you got to bring the real estate team in, sustainability team in, HR groups in, very important about the people.
Totally HR.
People first, goals. So that's really important. And bringing those constituents together, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and then there's the math side of it as well that you were mentioning before when we were talking was, net zero buildings and those require life cycle analyses, but also monitoring day to day, and that's the quality of the space for the people.
Right, and through energy modeling with our engineer partners, and is very important as you look at different building envelopes, and the tightness of the building is very important, obviously, and minimizing air filtration, right? So important to design and looking at new buildings, or even, I love the word adaptive reuse. Like taking an existing building, how do you make that better, right? Because you're reducing the embodied carbon by using a building, and then making it adaptable to maybe a new use is actually really exciting.
Yeah, and I think this is, again, where maybe we can bring Thomas back in, but motivating clients when you sit down with them, Eric, initially, some of them come in with an idea of what they want, but it's not always, what they actually want. That process of visioning gets you there. But as the two of you are sitting in those initial meetings, what do you see motivating people to take those essential climate action targets? Is it visibility? Is it brand differentiation, as you mentioned? Or is it something else?
Yeah, I think we've talked about different certification systems, and there's also, we haven't mentioned, WELL and FitWell and the Living Building Challenge. I mean, so we've done multiple projects with all those different certifications, not maybe all together, but our clients have unique goals, and by some of these projects, we can share success stories and metrics, and like we've reduced toxicity in the environment because of the Living Building Challenge project that we did in Brooklyn some years ago. So these projects are really kind of, really forward thinking, and I think those are the ones we kind of use to, share be very confidential, depending on how the client is too, and we share client metrics of success with our other clients, kind of inspire them. I think that helps. Maybe
Yeah, it does.
Part of the answer. Anyone add to that?
Yeah. Well, so, for example, at the project level, I could piggyback off the green lease example that I started with, because that's also what's so fascinating with green leases, is that they happen at the beginning of a project, right? So here we were in a situation where we knew a lot about the company's priorities and we knew a lot about the building. And we incorporated features that were of both landlord and tenants' interest into the lease. But now that we had all of that information, we could craft much more informed goals about what we could do with that space during the lease. So I would say that one way to, get people going for more is really about having parts of the process hold hands. So, learning about the site, doing the lease, can then feed into setting project requirements. And at that point, people just get creative, because not everyone wants to be up in the clouds and ask the really big questions. But when they see like, hey, we've got these and these features of this space or building, what can we do with it? Then really practical people get going, and they're like, oh yeah, we can approach that goal in this and that way. So, whether it's reaching for a certain level that we know we now can reach with, or we believe we can reach with a certification, and maybe there are some other features that came up along the way, so we know that that certification needs to emphasize, some health aspects or some energy aspects and so on. I think that's actually where things get really practical in a project. I'd also like to zoom out and say there's a value to creating a programmatic approach overall, meaning a lot of people don't actually ask the question of, why are we doing something? What is the priority? So I'm going to zoom one step further back, because it's something that it's something I care a lot about. I've been working with sustainability for over 15 years, and I've often come across situations, it could be projects or it could be organizations that have a really strong sustainability arm, a really strong sustainability leg. However, those legs and arms don't function very well unless they're plugged into a full body. So that arm can be as strong as you want, but when you plug it into a full-bodied approach, a full-bodied program, suddenly there's so much more sense. There's a heart, there's a head, and it all starts functioning together, and people start seeing it clearly. And what is that full-bodied approach? That's what I would call a sustainability program. Like, we've set up 6 steps where we will take clients through, it could be a real estate organization, through 6 steps. And when they've been through those 6 steps, they will have a full-bodied approach, which doesn't mean they have to be the best in the world. It just means it has to be complete. The first step there is about setting a clear and exciting direction for the rest of the program to follow. A lot of sustainability programs dive straight into data, for example. And there's so much data, and suddenly people are wading in data, they're swimming in data, it
can be helpful or it can be hurtful.
Yeah, and it's data, it's over their heads, but they don't necessarily even know what they're going to do with this data, so they collect even more. Whereas other people, they dive into implementations. It's a very great implementation, but then they need budgets for it, and then it's like, oh shit, what is the value? What is the purpose? So if we go back to the first step first, it's like clear, exciting direction for the rest to follow. Then it's like, okay, now we have the priorities. We can pair that with some meaningful goals. Everyone knows why they're meaningful. Now we know what the data serves for, which is the second step. When you now are informing progress with data, we can dive into the third, which is around implementation. And in a real estate organization setting with leasing, it would be to incorporate sustainability at every stage of the leasing cycle. So it's from site selection, design, construction, operation, and even closeout. If these stages hold hands, so much value gets passed on as opposed to having it slip through the cracks, which is, I've heard a lot of, we've been alluding to these cracks along the way. And then at the end, I just want to close up, because at that point, after implementation, now you can tell your story. It's not going to be greenwashing anymore, because you have things to tell about. And another of the last steps is around spreading this across the organization. So it's not just the sustainability person who does this. Everyone is a sustainability person.
Well, and that's
Yeah,
why I
nobody's
think
exempt.
and I think that's exactly why I think your analogy is apt for talking about circular value. Is when you build and flesh out a body of a program.
Yeah.
You're building a system.
Yes.
Right. And we've been talking today over and over about systems, because rather than just having an arm or a leg that don't talk to each other,
Yeah.
we're able to work together to increase the overall value. So I'd love to leave that there and just pick a book from maybe that you have been reading recently, Eric or Thomas, that you want to bring to the table for people to read this month.
Sure. Well, I just came out of a national park in Norway where I was crossing a mountain range during Easter.
Okay.
I went solo on skis and went through the elements and would spend entire days without seeing anyone. So there was a lot of silence. And along the way, I was thinking about a book written by, he's a bit of an idol to me. He's called Erling Kagge, Kagge. He's also a very entertaining person. He's an explorer who was the first to do the 3 poles, so the North, South Pole, and the Everest alone. And so in all of those expeditions, he experienced a lot of silence. And that's the name of the book I recommend. It's Silence. And he talks about what the value of silence is to us. And why am I bringing it up in this context? Well, because I think that the best way that we can approach sustainability, but also just ourselves as human beings, is to experience silence, and ideally do that out in nature. You won't always understand why on earth you should go out there, but when you're out there, you will understand.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, that's great. Great story. I think for me, it's, we mentioned maybe the name earlier, is William McDonough's Cradle to Cradle.
Fantastic.
A really influential book, and probably, before the circular economy phrase came out, was really about circular economy, and really about reduce, reuse, and recycle. So I remember getting that book and actually meeting William McDonough at my first Greenbuild event,
Awesome.
early 2000s. So
I think I
it's
met
about
him
20
around
years
there too. That's cool.
about 20 years
Yeah.
ago, right?
Yeah.
So a great book. It's on my library of architectural and environmental design books. So it's something I probably need to bring in and remind some of the folks in my studio about.
Definitely.
Who are maybe newer to this topic. So exciting book. Again, I'd recommend you read it if you haven't read it.
Definitely.
So,
Thank you.
Well, Thomas, Eric, Max, Johns, thank you so much for your guys' time today. Thank you for highlighting to us not only the value that circular methods of thought and circular economies can bring to our projects, but also for highlighting it in April.
that's right.
So
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
look forward to seeing
Yeah.
what the Sustainability Committee at CoreNet does next.
Awesome.
Great.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Happy Earth
Appreciate
Month.
Yes.
it. Yeah.